There are two photographs that tell you everything you need to know about a life spent reaching for something just beyond your grasp. In the first, two young girls stand side by side in matching coats, their dark hair swept back in identical styles. They could be twins, but they're not. One of them will become a legend. The other will spend her entire life standing beside that legend, always visible, never quite seen. In the second photograph, taken decades later, one woman stands on the steps of the White House in a light pink suit, her face perfectly composed. The other woman stands nearby, equally elegant, equally composed, watching from the periphery. But here's what the photographs don't show: the generational machinery that created this moment, the patterns that began before either girl was born, the way mothers teach daughters to compare themselves to each other, the way a single look of approval or disapproval gets internalized and repeated across decades, the way one woman's sense of inadequacy becomes another woman's constant companion. Radziwill spent her entire life standing next to her sister. But that wasn't really the problem. The problem was that her mother had taught her to stand there. And her mother had learned that lesson from someone before her. And somewhere in the distant past, a woman had internalized the message: you are not enough. You will never be enough. Your job is to support someone else's greatness while pretending you don't mind being invisible. This is not a story about two sisters. This is a story about how a family's patterns of comparison, inadequacy, and conditional love get passed down from generation to generation. It's about Lee trying desperately to break free from a mold she didn't create but couldn't escape. It's about watching someone recognize their own patterns clearly enough to describe them, yet remain trapped by them anyway. It's about the tragedy of self-awareness without the power to change. To understand Lee Radziwill, you have to understand Janet Norton Lee Auchincloss and what she passed down to her daughters without ever speaking it aloud. Janet Norton Lee came from old money. She grew up in a world where women were valuable primarily for one thing: their ability to marry well. A woman's entire life was organized around this single purpose. Everything else, her intelligence, her creativity, her individual dreams, these were secondary to the fundamental question: who will she marry? Janet learned this lesson perfectly. She internalized it so completely that it became invisible to her. It became simply the way the world worked. It became what she believed was true. She married John Vernu Bouvier III, a handsome stockbroker with a drinking problem. The marriage was transactional. Two families joining fortunes. It was respectable. It was what was expected. It was also, from nearly the beginning, inadequate. John Bouvier divided his life into separate compartments. There was the wife in New York, there was the mistress in Paris, there were the daughters, somewhere in between, raised primarily by servants. When John was home, he was distant. When he was away, which was often, his absence was felt as a kind of rejection. Janet maintained a pristine home where appearances mattered infinitely more than truth. She learnt to smile while her husband maintained another life. She learned to present perfection to the world while managing chaos at home. She learned that a woman's job was to make everything look effortless while working desperately behind the scenes to hold it all together. This became her template for motherhood. This became what she would teach her daughters. She had two girls, Jacqueline, born in 1929, and Caroline Lee, born in 1933. From the very beginning, Janet noticed a difference between them. Jackie had something that transcended beauty, a quality that made people lean in when she spoke. Lee had classical beauty, the kind that cameras loved, but that diminished as you aged. Janet never said this explicitly. She didn't need to. In the careful silence of their household, the comparison was more powerful than any spoken words could have been. Through Janet's slight preference for Jackie's company, through the way her eyes lingered longer on Jackie's accomplishments, through the subtle shift in her tone when discussing her daughters, Lee learned the fundamental lesson: you are second. You will always be second. When their parents divorced in 1940, after years of John Bouvier's increasingly open infidelities, Janet responded, not with grief, but with cold efficiency. She had been betrayed, humiliated, made to feel inadequate as a woman. Her response was to find a replacement, someone wealthier, someone with better connections, someone who would erase the shame of having been left for someone else. She married Hugh Auchincloss within 2 years. He was substantially wealthier than John Bouvier. He had better social connections. He had properties that announced status and permanence. But what he couldn't do was undo the wound that John Bouvier had created in his daughters. By the time Hugh arrived in their lives, both girls had already learned something essential about love. Men leave. Men choose other things. You cannot make them stay. And wanting them to stay is weakness. For Lee, who was only 10 when the divorce happened, the lesson was particularly clear. Her father had chosen his mistress over his family. He'd chosen freedom, adventure, another life. He'd made this choice openly and without apparent remorse. When he died in the Titanic disaster in 1912, no wait, that was before Lee's time. When Lee's father died, it would eventually be from his own excesses, his own inability to manage his life responsibly. But the wound was already there before he died. The wound was established through his daily choices to be absent, to prioritize his own desires, to treat his wife and daughters as obligations rather than priorities. Lee watched her mother endure this. She watched her mother smile and maintain appearances while managing disappointment and inadequacy. And she understood that this was what marriage was. This was what love looked like. This was the price women paid for the security that came with being married to someone important. The Auchincloss properties, Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Glen Aura in Virginia, the Park Avenue apartment, were vastly more impressive than anything the Bouvier family had owned. But they came with a price. The girls' world expanded, but their place in it became less central. They were no longer the focus of their mother's universe. They were part of a larger family structure that included Auchincloss's children from previous marriages. They had step-siblings now. They had a stepfather who was pleasant, but not their father, involved, but not deeply attached. Jackie adapted to this with her characteristic grace. She seemed to understand instinctively how to navigate complex social hierarchies. She befriended her step-siblings. She charmed her stepfather. She moved through these newly complex family dynamics as if she'd been born to them. Lee watched her sister navigate this world successfully. She watched Jackie move closer to their mother. She watched the space between herself and her mother widen. Their mother's message became increasingly clear, not through words, but through actions. Jackie is special. Jackie has something you don't have. Jackie will succeed where you must simply survive. Jackie will be remembered. You will be forgotten unless you attach yourself to someone important enough to give you reflected significance. And this was the inheritance Lee received from her mother. Not money, though there was that, not social position, though there was that too, but something more insidious, the internalization of her own inadequacy, the acceptance that she would always be second, and the understanding that her only hope for relevance was to marry someone important enough to carry her along on his accomplishments. Janet never said this explicitly. She didn't need to. The pattern was written into every family dinner, every comparison, every subtle shift in her mother's attention and approval. Jump forward to 1951. Lee is 18 years old. She is, by any objective standard, extraordinarily beautiful. She has been trained her entire life in the social graces that were essential for a woman of her position. She speaks French fluently. She knows which fork to use at a formal dinner. She knows how to smile for cameras. She knows how to present herself to the world in a way that suggests she has more depth than she actually possesses. But she also knows, in a way she can't fully articulate, that beauty is temporary, that her mother's approval is conditional, that her entire value rests on finding someone important to marry. Michael Canfield appears in her life like an answer to a prayer she's been praying her entire life. He's handsome. He works in publishing, a respectable profession. There are rumours he's actually the illegitimate son of the Duke of Kent. The rumours are never confirmed, but they don't need to be confirmed. What matters is that he seems like someone important enough to give Lee's life the significance her mother has been implying she lacks. The wedding in 1953 is the kind of society event her mother loves to orchestrate. Lee wears white. She smiles for the cameras, and for the first time in her life, she's not Jackie's sister. She's a bride. She's a wife. She's someone creating her own story. But here's what's crucial. She doesn't actually love Michael Canfield. She barely knows him. She's marrying him for the same reason her mother married Hugh Auchincloss, because he represents a solution to the fundamental inadequacy she's been taught to feel about herself. She's replicating the pattern before she's even old enough to recognize it. The marriage is hollow from the beginning. Michael Canfield is distant in ways that Lee's own father was distant. He has his own interests. He's not particularly invested in building a partnership with his wife. He's married, yes, but he's also somehow absent, even when he's present. And here's the thing Lee doesn't understand yet. She chose this. She didn't choose consciously, but she chose nonetheless. She chose a man who mirrored the emotional unavailability of her own father, because that was the only template she possessed. She chose a man who couldn't really see her because she'd been trained her entire life not to expect to be seen. The best she could hope for was to be married to someone important enough that his importance would reflect back on her. She moves to London with Michael. She tries to create a life that feels authentic. She throws dinner parties. She cultivates friendships. She wears beautiful clothes. But something fundamental is missing. The marriage is wrong from the beginning, and she knows it, but she doesn't know how to change it. She's already trapped in a pattern that was established before she was born. Her sister Jackie, meanwhile, has met Jack Kennedy. Jackie is becoming important in her own right. Jackie has a life that's expanding rather than contracting. Jackie is being seen and celebrated, not for who she's married to, but for who she is. And Lee is watching this happen from London. She's watching her sister become everything she was supposed to become. She's watching Jackie escape the shadow that Lee never quite escaped. But here's the subtle cruelty. Lee doesn't know that this is what's happening. She doesn't understand yet that she's trapped in a repetition of her mother's life. She only knows that her sister is becoming more important, more visible, more celebrated. And she knows that she, Lee, is becoming less so. In 1958, Lee meets Stanislas Radziwill. He's a Polish prince, a real one, with actual lineage and actual titles, though they mean nothing in the modern world. He's handsome and cultured and intelligent, and he seems to see her, not as Jackie's sister, not as a beauty to be displayed, but as a complete person with thoughts and opinions and value. For Lee, who has never been seen this way, this feels like salvation. She divorces Michael Canfield and marries Stas almost immediately, and for a moment, it seems like she might have escaped. She has a title now, Princess Lee Radziwill. She has something that's entirely her own. She has a man who seems to value her for who she is, rather than what she represents. For a few years, the marriage is genuinely good. They have 2 children together. They travel. They build a life that reflects her own tastes and interests. Stas supports her ambitions. He encourages her to pursue her interests beyond the traditional roles of wife and mother. But what Lee doesn't recognize is that she's still trapped in a pattern. She's still defining herself through a man. She's still looking to someone else to give her life meaning. She's still trying to find validation outside of herself. She's repeating the fundamental structure of her mother's life, just with different details. But then Jackie becomes First Lady, and everything changes forever. Suddenly, Jackie isn't just important. Jackie is iconic. Jackie is the most photographed, most discussed, most analysed woman in the world. Jackie's life is no longer just impressive, it's historically significant. And Lee is her sister. For the first time in her life, Lee's proximity to her sister becomes a source not of comfort, but of pain. Because now the comparison is absolute. Now it's not abstract. Now it's visible in photographs. Now it's written into history. Lee visits the White House constantly. She's there more than almost anyone outside the immediate Kennedy family. She and Jackie call each other daily. They share private jokes and observations. The love between them is genuine and deep. But so is the pain, because every time Lee is in the White House, she's reminded that this isn't her life. This is Jackie's life. She's a visitor here. She's the sister. She's the supporting character in her sister's story. She watches people ask Jackie about her opinions, her thoughts, her ideas. She watches ambassadors and movie stars and the most powerful people in the world compete for Jackie's attention. And then they turn to Lee and ask, "What's Jackie really like? Can you introduce me to her?" Lee handles this with grace. She smiles. She plays the role assigned to her. But privately, friends notice the strain. She drinks more than she used to. Her wit, which is always sharp, sometimes has an edge that cuts close to cruelty. She's watching her sister become everything she was supposed to become. She's watching her sister escape the shadow that Lee has never quite escaped. And she's learning a terrible lesson in the process. No matter what you accomplish, no matter what you achieve, no matter how hard you try, if your sister is exceptional, you will always be second. Truman Capote becomes one of her closest friends during this period. He's someone who sees her, not as Jackie's sister, not as a beautiful woman to be displayed, but as Lee fully herself. Intelligent, complex, interesting. Their friendship becomes a lifeline for Lee. It becomes the one place where she doesn't have to compete with her sister. It becomes the one relationship where she's valued for who she is, rather than who she's related to. But here's what's important. Lee becomes dependent on Capote in a way that echoes her mother's dependence on men to give her life meaning. She needs Capote to see her because no one else does. She needs his validation because her own sense of self-worth is too fragile to stand on its own. She's replicating the pattern again. She's looking outside of herself for the validation that she should be cultivating internally. She's making another person responsible for her sense of worth. In 1963, Lee invites Jackie to join her on a vacation to Greece. Aristotle Onassis offers them use of his yacht. The trip is meant to be a simple escape. But Lee has become close to Onassis. Very close. He listens when she talks. He seems genuinely interested in her opinions. He makes her feel valued in a way that few men ever have. When Onassis begins paying attention to Jackie after the assassination, Lee understands exactly what's happening. She sees her sister's widow status being transformed into romantic interest. She sees the man she was close to turning his considerable charm toward her sister. She sees the pattern repeating itself yet again. It doesn't matter that Lee might not have wanted to marry Onassis. What matters is that he chose Jackie. Again, the man chose Jackie. Again, Lee was second choice. Again, her sister got the thing that Lee wanted. And again, Lee had to smile and maintain composure and pretend that she was fine with this outcome. She's learning, over and over and over, that her role in this family is to be second. Her role is to support. Her role is to be grateful for the scraps of attention she receives when her sister is busy being iconic. By the 1970s, Lee has begun to understand, on some level, what's happening. She knows that she's trapped in a pattern. She knows that no matter what she accomplishes, she'll always be measured against her sister. She knows that the comparison is unfair and inescapable. And she knows that knowing this doesn't help, because she can't escape it. The pattern was established before she was born. It's been reinforced every day of her life. It's written into the family structure in ways that seem immutable. So Lee makes a desperate decision. She's going to try to become something her own, completely separate from her sister. She's going to try to break free from the role that's been assigned to her. She decides to become an actress. There's a cruel irony in Lee's choice to become an actress. Acting is, fundamentally, about being someone else. It's about performing a role. It's about being seen and appreciated for the skill with which you embody a character. But Lee has been acting her entire life. She's been performing the role of the beautiful woman, the supportive sister, the woman who smiles while her heart is breaking. She's been perfecting this performance since childhood. What she hasn't learned how to do is be herself. In 1967, she appears in a television production of a classic play. The critics are harsh. They call her performance amateurish and stiff. They question whether she's earned the role through talent or name recognition. And here's what's crucial. Lee knows they're right. She knows she's not a good actress. She knows she's trying to use her beauty and connections to compensate for a lack of actual talent. But she tries again anyway. She takes acting lessons. She works with coaches. She tries harder. Because trying harder is what she's been trained to do her entire life. In 1968, she appears in another production. The critics are equally harsh. This time, Lee begins to understand that she can't act her way out of this pattern. She can't perform her way to significance. She can't use beauty and connections to compensate for the lack of genuine talent. By 1972, when she tries one more time in a production in Chicago, the reviews follow her. They write the same things they've written before. And Lee finally hears them. She stops pursuing acting after that. But here's what's important. The failure of her acting career is symbolic. It's a physical manifestation of the larger pattern of her life. She tried to create something that was entirely her own. She tried to establish herself as a separate person with her own accomplishments, and she failed. And she had to fail publicly. She had to fail in front of critics and audiences, and her sister. She had to fail in a way that was documented and discussed and compared to her sister's successes. She couldn't even fail privately. She turns to interior design next. It's a field where her natural taste and connections can actually help her succeed. And for a while, this works. She's genuinely talented at design. People hire her based on the quality of her work. For a few years, she has something that's entirely her own. But the success is always tinged with inadequacy, because she knows, on some level, that she could have done something greater. She knows that she settled for interior design because she couldn't be an actress. She knows that she's making a life out of consolation prizes. And more importantly, she knows that her sister will never need to settle. Her sister will never need to make do with a career that's merely competent. Her sister's legacy will be vast and significant and historically important. Lee's legacy will be the beautiful interiors she designed for people who will forget her name. Lee marries 3 times. Each marriage follows the same pattern. She finds a man who seems important enough to give her life meaning. She attaches herself to him with the desperate hope that his accomplishments and significance will reflect back on her. She tries to build a life with him that feels authentic. And then she discovers that he can't provide what she's looking for, because what she's looking for can't come from outside of herself. The first marriage to Michael Canfield ends because he's emotionally unavailable in ways that echo her own father. The second marriage, to Stanislas Radziwill, lasts longer because Stas is actually a decent man who tries to support her ambitions. But even this marriage fails because Lee is still fundamentally looking outside of herself for validation. She's still fundamentally trapped in a pattern that was established before she was born. The third marriage, to Herbert Ross, fails because Ross is so invested in his own career that Lee finds herself alone again, married, but not really partnered. By 1991, when she divorces Herbert Ross for the final time, Lee stops trying to fix the pattern through marriage. She's 58 years old. She's been married 3 times. She's tried acting. She's tried interior design. She's tried every strategy she can think of to escape the fundamental inadequacy that was instilled in her by her mother. And nothing has worked. She goes back to simply being Lee. She keeps the Radziwill name because it gives her a title, because it gives her the illusion that she's more than just Jackie's sister. But it's an illusion. And Lee, by this point in her life, knows it. During the 1980s and into the 1990s, Lee and Jackie have long conversations about their lives. These conversations happen late at night, usually after both sisters have been drinking. They talk about their childhood. They talk about their mother. They talk about the comparisons and the expectations and the ways they've been shaped by forces that predate them. Jackie admits that she's always understood the dynamic. She's always known that Lee was struggling in her shadow. She's always felt guilty about it, on some level. Lee admits that she spent her entire life trying to escape from something that she could never quite escape from. They acknowledge the pattern. They speak it aloud. They recognize it with the kind of clarity that only comes from being trapped in it for so long. But the acknowledgement doesn't change anything. They still have the same dynamic. They still call each other with the same frequency. They still maintain the same roles. Jackie the icon, Lee the supporter. Because recognizing a pattern doesn't automatically free you from it. Understanding your own psychology doesn't necessarily give you the power to change your behavior. This is the most tragic part of the story. Not that Lee was trapped in a pattern, not even that the pattern was unfair and inescapable, but that she understood the pattern, could articulate it, could recognize exactly how it was damaging her, and still couldn't break free from it. On May 19th, 1994, Jackie Kennedy Onassis dies. She's 64 years old. Lee is with her at the end. The grief is immediate and overwhelming. But so is something else, something that Lee doesn't admit to anyone, but that's written all over her face in the photographs from the funeral. Loss of identity. For 61 years, Lee has been Jackie's sister. That role has defined her. It's constrained her. It's limited her. But it's also given her a place in the world. It's given her a context for her existence. It's explained who she was in relation to someone else. Now that someone else is gone, and Lee is left to answer a question she's never had to answer before. Who am I without my sister? The answer, it turns out, is terrifying, because without her sister, Lee is just a woman in her 60s with no major accomplishments, no significant role, no clear purpose. She's not the mother of any children who've gone on to do important things. She's not the creator of anything that will last. She's not anyone, in her own right, that anyone will remember. She's Jackie's sister. That was her entire identity. And now, Jackie is dead. When Jackie's will is read, Lee learns that she's inherited a few pieces of furniture, some books, a bracelet. Nothing of financial substance. Nothing that suggests that Jackie, in the end, saw Lee as anything more than a sister by blood and obligation. The years of daily phone calls, the countless visits, the shared history spanning more than 6 decades, all of it distilled down to a few personal mementos that fit in a single box. Lee sits in the lawyer's office and hears her entire identity read back to her in the form of financial bequests. And she understands, finally and completely, what she's always known on some level. She was never enough. She was never going to be enough. Her sister, even in death, is confirming what Lee's mother taught her 60 years ago. You are second. You will always be second. Your value is contingent on your proximity to someone more important than you. Jackie's will is, in effect, a confirmation of everything Lee has always believed about herself. Her son, Anthony, becomes sick. He's diagnosed with testicular cancer in 1989. For several years, he's in remission. And then, just months after Jackie's death, just when Lee is most vulnerable and most lost, the cancer returns. Lee throws herself into helping him fight it. She researches treatments. She consults with specialists. She pays for experimental therapies. She does everything she possibly can to save her son's life. But it's not enough. No amount of money or connections or desperate effort can prevent the inevitable. Anthony dies on August 10th, 1990. He's 40 years old. And Lee, who has spent her entire life in her sister's shadow, now faces a grief that's entirely her own. She's lost not just her sister, but her son. She's lost the scaffolding of family that's held her up, however inadequately, throughout her life. More than that, she's recognized a pattern repeating itself through the generations. She was a daughter who couldn't match her sister. Anthony was a son who was trying to build his own career, his own life, independent of the family name. He died before he got the chance to truly escape. The pattern that began with her mother, the pattern of comparison, inadequacy, and conditional love, is still active. It's still destructive. It's still capable of taking lives. In the years after Anthony's death, Lee becomes increasingly withdrawn. She still appears at important events. She still maintains her public persona, but the performance is costing her more and more. She's watched the pattern repeat itself across 3 generations now. Her mother taught her to measure herself against an impossible standard. She's done the same with her own children. And the destruction has continued. She knows this. She understands this with a clarity that comes from decades of living inside the pattern. She can articulate exactly what's happening. She can explain the psychology. She can trace the damage back through the generations. But she can't escape it. And more importantly, she can't undo the damage she's done to her own children. This is the real tragedy. Not that Lee was trapped in a pattern, not even that she understood the pattern and couldn't escape from it, but that in the process of being trapped in it, she perpetuated it. She passed the wound to the next generation, and by the time she understood what she was doing, it was too late to change course. In 2013, at age 80, Lee gives an interview. She speaks more candidly than usual about her relationship with Jackie. She describes feeling like she'd always been second choice, always living in shadow. She talks about the pain of watching her sister become an icon while she remained a footnote. But the interviewer notices something crucial. Lee is not angry at Jackie. She's not resentful of her sister for becoming famous. She's not bitter about the comparison. She's devastated by her own complicity in the pattern. Lee talks about how she internalized her mother's comparisons, how she taught herself to measure her own worth by her proximity to Jackie, how she made choices that kept her trapped in her sister's shadow rather than making choices that would have freed her. She's describing a fundamental truth. The pattern wasn't something that was done to her. It was something that was done to her mother and her mother's mother and the generations before them. But at some point, the cycle requires the cooperation of the person trapped in it. At some point, you have to make the choice to measure yourself against an impossible standard. At some point, you have to decide that your sister's accomplishments make your accomplishments irrelevant. Lee made those choices. Every day of her life, she made the choice to stay trapped in the pattern. And now, at age 80, she's recognizing that choice with a clarity that's almost unbearable. In the 2000s and 2010s, Lee's health declines. She has mobility issues. She moves more slowly. The mask that she's worn for decades becomes heavier. But she still dresses beautifully. She still maintains the standards of appearance that were drilled into her as a child. She still refuses to let the facade slip entirely. Because to let the facade slip would be to acknowledge how completely the pattern has consumed her life. To let the facade slip would be to admit that she spent 80 years trying to escape from something that she never truly escaped. It would be to admit that her entire life has been lived in her sister's shadow, and that she allowed that shadow to define her. It would be to acknowledge that she had the power to break free at any point along the way, and she chose not to exercise that power. Because breaking free would have meant doing something radical. It would have meant refusing to measure herself against her sister. It would have meant building a life based on her own values rather than her mother's expectations. It would have meant being willing to be invisible, truly invisible, without trying to borrow significance from someone else. She wasn't brave enough for that. She wasn't willing to risk that kind of anonymity. So she stayed trapped, and she let the shadow define her. And she carried that shadow into every relationship, every career choice, every decision she made. Lee Radziwill dies on February 15th, 2019, at age 85. The obituaries mention Jackie in the first paragraph. Even in death, Lee can't escape the comparison. Even in her final moment of significance, the announcement of her death, she's defined primarily in relation to her sister. She's Jackie Kennedy's sister. That's the first thing people need to know about her. That's the most important thing about her life. And Lee, even after 85 years, can't escape that identity. The funeral is private. There's no state funeral. There's no outpouring of national grief. Lee's passing is noted by those who remembered her. She's mourned by those who loved her. And she's largely forgotten by a world that never quite figured out who she was beyond her sister's shadow. We tell ourselves that Lee Radziwill's tragedy was unique. We tell ourselves that it was the product of extraordinary circumstances. The daughter of a famous man, the sister of the First Lady, born into a world of wealth and privilege where comparisons seemed inevitable. But the truth is more unsettling, because the pattern that trapped Lee isn't unique to her. It's not limited to wealthy families or families with extraordinary circumstances. The pattern is this. A mother passes down to her daughter the message that her worth is conditional. That worth is measured not by who she is, but by her proximity to someone important. That her job is to support, not to lead. That her role is to make everything look effortless while working desperately behind the scenes. The daughter internalizes this message. She spends her life trying to prove that she's valuable. She measures herself constantly against an impossible standard. She makes choices that keep her trapped in the pattern, and eventually, she passes the same message down to her own children. Every person watching this story sees themselves in it. Maybe you're not the sister. Maybe you're the one who always seems less important than someone else in your family. Maybe you've spent your life trying to prove your worth through achievement, or beauty, or the status of the person you married. Maybe you've recognized, somewhere along the way, that you're trapped in a pattern. Maybe you've understood exactly how the pattern is damaging you and limiting you and keeping you from becoming who you could be. And maybe, like Lee, you've found that knowing this doesn't automatically free you, because breaking free from a generational pattern requires more than self-awareness. It requires the willingness to be invisible sometimes. It requires the courage to build a life based on your own values, rather than your family's expectations. It requires accepting that you might never be recognized for who you are. You might never be celebrated. You might never be remembered. You might just be yourself. And maybe that's enough. But to Lee Radziwill, that was never enough. To Lee, being herself was less valuable than being someone's sister, someone's wife, someone's reflection of someone else's importance. So she stayed trapped, and the pattern continued, and the shadow consumed her entirely. Here's what we lost when we reduced Lee Radziwill to Jackie's sister. We lost the opportunity to understand how patterns work. We lost the chance to recognize ourselves in her struggle. We lost the mirror that could have shown us our own complicity in the patterns that trap us. Because that's what this story really is. It's not a story about two sisters. It's not a story about the tragedy of being born into a famous family. It's a story about what happens when we internalize the belief that we're not enough. It's a story about what happens when we measure ourselves against an impossible standard and then teach others to do the same. It's a story about the generational transmission of trauma, about how a wound that begins with one mother can spread through a family like a bloodline, causing damage that echoes across decades. But more than that, it's a story about choice, because at any point in her life, Lee could have chosen differently. She could have refused to measure herself against her sister. She could have built a life based on her own values rather than her family's expectations. She could have been brave enough to be invisible, truly invisible, without trying to borrow significance from someone else. She didn't make that choice, and that's the real tragedy. Not that the pattern existed, not even that it was passed down to her without her consent, but that, once she recognized it, once she understood it, once she could articulate exactly how it was damaging her, she still chose to stay trapped in it. She had the power to break free, and she chose not to use it. That's the most unsettling part of this story, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that at some point, the patterns that trap us become patterns that we participate in, that at some point, recognizing a pattern doesn't absolve us of responsibility for continuing to replicate it. Lee Radziwill recognized her pattern. She understood it. She could articulate it with devastating clarity, but she remained trapped by it anyway. And now, as we look at her life from the outside, we have to ask ourselves, in what ways am I doing the same thing? Where am I trapped in a pattern that I recognize but don't break free from? Where am I choosing to stay in the shadow when I could step into the light? That's the real power of Lee's story, not that it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of comparison, but that it's a mirror. And mirrors are always more unsettling than cautionary tales, because you can't avoid seeing yourself in them.